Travis, let's move to you and talk about the governance side of the non-governance committee. Obviously, lots of stuff going on. So let me flip it to you.
Yeah. So in NGC, to your point at the beginning, the question of, okay, well, what is it that NGC does as opposed to other committees, and how does that get allocated? One of the funny things that's come out of the last few years is the NGC has kind of said, well, because we get to decide in large part where a lot of the responsibilities lay among the different committees, we're going to allocate certain things to ourselves as opposed to others. So for example, I think a recent study showed that a majority of US public companies have either a separate ESG committee or have ESG allocated to the nomination and governance committee. I'll just say for the purpose of this discussion, it's going to be helpful for us to kind of break it up into different committees, human capital and comp committee, things like that. And it also helps for everybody's egos on the call as well. And so I don't have to cover all of it. But an important part of what the NGC is doing is trying to allocate oversight of these different topics to different committees. And as David mentioned, make sure that there's the right skill set in those particular committees in order to exercise that oversight. A funny thing about it with all of these new directors, as Dave was mentioning, is some of them have never been a public company director. Some of them have never been in the C-suite at all and don't really have the training that they need. I'll commend to the people that are on the call to think about some of the things that Janice and Stephen and Dave are going to be talking about and say, well, maybe my board needs training on those types of things, and I can recommend to NACD to suggest topics for future programming. Risk oversight, though, is one where allocating the different types of risk oversight often falls directly to audit. And we're finding more and more that a lot of NomGov committees over the last year or two are realizing that there's just not enough time on audit for them to look at every single mission critical risk out there. And they're reallocating certain things to certain committees, or they're actually establishing separate risk committees. Often that's in the context of an ESG committee. The allocation is usually done year over year as part of the annual board review, but it's something for a NomGov committee to make sure is specifically allocated so that if there is an incident that inevitably happens to someone every year, that there's that record of oversight that's being expressed. And that separately and apart from that, the NomGov committee is going to have the policies, procedures, and committee charters that allocate those responsibilities in a crystal clear way. Obviously, if you're a public company, most of your institutional investors are requiring that anyways, and the SEC as well. So right now, if you go and do a survey of public company charters of a NomGov committee, like I said, a majority of them are going to allocate that ESG responsibility to the NomGov committee if it's not in a separate ESG committee. There are some questions, though, of whether or not the NGC itself should be the one to cover those. So a great example is sustainability reporting. Just because somebody's on the NGC committee and has responsibility over ESG doesn't mean that they really understand scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 GHG emissions, or that they understand disclosure controls. A lot of the time, those things are better allocated to the audit committee. Those are things that we can talk about later. For training, technology is one of the biggest items that we've seen over the last year. Coming out of the pandemic, there was the pandemic response. Now there's been a sort of normalization on that and a bigger focus on what are we going to have this year, whether that's recession response or the like. The technology adaptation, whether that's adopting cybersecurity, data privacy controls, AI and the like, or it's something more simple like just basic disclosure controls over accounting, are things that we're seeing more missing from some of the NGC discussions. I know Dave mentioned investor activism, and so I'll talk briefly about shareholder engagement. Obviously, the NomGov committee is usually the one that is responsible for ensuring that the corporation's organizational documents and other items reflect the best practices, or at least the standards set by the board with respect to a combined CEO chair, a lead independent director, and whether there are takeover defenses like a classified board, supermajority voting standards. ISS and Glass Lewis continue to tighten the screws with vote against recommendations. Usually those are targeted at the NomGov chair, or if you have a classified board, whoever the member of that committee is that's going to be up that year. But even outside of those litmus test items, it's the NGC that's having to deal with the ESG scores, most often that are coming from ISS, and finding ways to tweak the governance in order to meet the expectations of ISS and institutional investors, or sometimes explain to those investors and ISS why they're not going to make sense this year. A couple of recent developments just to talk about are in the bylaws. There's a big case in front of Massimo right now at the Delaware Chancery Court, talking about advance notice bylaws to try and stem the tide of activism. We're seeing that some of the companies that are being a little too aggressive are being held to task by the activist investors, and institutional investors are seeing some of these changes as being disenfranchising to the shareholder voting base. To Dave's earlier point about upgrading your directors, one of the best defenses to activism is actually looking and seeing who are your directors that are most likely to get replaced. Maybe you go ahead and either accelerate your succession planning or go through the process of actually removing and replacing or shrinking the board in order to limit some of those vulnerabilities. I'll be honest, I hear that a lot. I don't see too many companies doing that just because of what it does to the existing board dynamics. And if somebody has a question, we can cover it, but we don't need to get into too much on what you do once you have a block holder or conflicted director or insurgent director on that board. Special committees, confidentiality concerns, and the like are something the Delaware courts explored a lot last year. And we've seen a lot of people, particularly the NomGov committees that set up those, let's say, protective structures on the board of directors get popped with lawsuits for it. So I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you, Travis. I had a question for you that was going to talk about how do you manage all the new regulations that are coming out, but you did a really nice job kind of answering that. And I suspect in the open Q&A, we'll come back to that. So my new question for you is, you know, from time to time, a particular committee seems to be in the hot seat all the time. You know, it used to be audit, maybe it still is audit, and then it went to compensation for a while. It feels like it's moving to the non-governance committee with all of the external pressures, the uncertainty, the succession, the litigation. What's the profile for non-gov committee members and then maybe even more importantly, the chair? And what do companies look for in that?
Well, I can definitely say Dave might have some thoughts on the recruitment side. I will say for my part, the NomGov committee should be independent. They should be diverse. One of the important things that we've seen over the years is the more diverse candidates that you have, or I guess members on the NGC, the more likely it is that you wind up with more diverse directors more broadly and more diverse executives. But the more critical function is that independence. If you have a NomGov committee that is not truly independent of the management team, they're going to do a lot more deference to the management team in terms of how governance is actually implemented, whether that's the examples that we saw with McDonald's and workplace harassment discussions, examples that we've seen, even simple things going back to Bluebell and Boeing, where an NGC member might say, I trust the management team to handle this for me. That's not how oversight works. That's not how the director's responsibilities work. It really is an obligation to ask the right questions, to make sure that your other directors are skilled enough and understand enough to be able to ask the right questions, and to make sure that they can pressure test management when they do push back.
Great, thanks, Travis. So